how to help people who are suffering or struggling or in crisis. We use that word crisis at some point. And it doesn't have to be, the world's largest crisis, but when we encounter people, could be at work, could be in our family, could be in our personal relationships, could be related to us or not related to us. But how to help? That's what we were kind of talking about that generally, and one of the ideas that came up is, when a person is in crisis, it's almost like a state. It almost requires like medical triage. You know, you have to stop the bleeding before you attend to lesser ailments. You have to attend to the big thing before attending to the smaller things. Do the most important thing first. And it mostly is about restoring the person to some state of stability. And I think the same is true when a person is emotionally upset. If something has happened to upset them, and it's a psycho emotional crisis, the same principle is there. That there's no that's if a person's in a state of if they're well outside of their equilibrium, that's not the time to give them high philosophy. uh, that's the time to, first things first, help them get back to a state of equilibrium. And most often, people, when they're in a state of a psycho emotional crisis, mostly they want to be hugged. You know, they want to be validated. They want to be uh, affirmed. They want to be loved. That's they want to be hugged. That's mostly what we want, I think, when we're initially in that stage. And yet, giving the hugs and affirmations and validations and uh, isn't really enough to solve the long term issues, the long term problem. It's, I mean, sometimes things happen to us tragically. Somebody we love passes away, no fault of our own, and we're left with grief. The long term solution to grief requires more than just hugs. But sometimes we create our own suffering. Sometimes our emotional crisis is of our own making. To solve that problem, we need usually hugs and validation. Seldom you get that problem solved. It requires critical self examination. And that's usually not what a person wants when they're experiencing a kind of a crisis.
So when someone is going through trauma, suffering, being triggered, being upset, which is all of us at some point or the other,
Right.
most of us don't have the awareness or the need to seek help, whether the help that we seek must come from within or without. Especially since the wounds are not physical in nature, they're mental and emotional, or otherwise. Otherwise, in the sense we don't even know. Everything seems to be okay, but somehow I'm depressed. I'm not happy. It could be any number of things.
Right.
And you're saying that no amount of spiritual counsel is going to help at that time. No high level thinking, no critical thinking is going to evolve by itself at that time. It requires just basic level. Now, when I say basic, means most fundamental level, pure, unconditional love and acceptance from anyone. Because the person tends to reject himself or herself and not able to come to terms with that there is something lovable in me, or since this bad thing has happened, whether created by me or by circumstances or by somebody else, we tend to throw a baby with the bathwater. So the question is that when I am suffering and nothing seems to be making any sense and no practice, no matter how much I have done those practice, meditation or spiritual practices or otherwise, is coming to my rescue in the sense that I don't even feel like engaging myself in it. And I'm not in a relaxed state. I'm stressed, whether the stress is physical, mental, emotional, or otherwise. So, what to do in a situation? What can a person do if we are saying that most people, 95, 99% of people, are not going to come knocking at your door asking for help? So, what is it a person can do by self? Or if you see somebody, if you observe somebody at home, in a workplace, or even in a societal situation where you see that the other person is in stress or distress, what is the first thing that we can do?
Well,
What will be the equivalent of that? Hug that person. Sometime we're able to hug that person physically or over the phone or by text message, but what if we're not able to?
well, let's take it one step even lower. Let's say we are that person rather than what can we do for another. What if we are that person? What if we are well, I mean, one thing I think that's important is that it's helpful for us to understand that when we're in a state of emotional distress, we're well outside our comfort zone of equilibrium. Uh, we're feeling threatened in some way, like we're in emotional distress. It's important to understand that uh, that neurologically we experience contraction. Oh, like our perspective, our range of vision becomes constricted. Our parameters for creative problem solving become constricted. We get tunnel vision. Our repertoire of response mechanisms becomes constricted. So we're operating in deficit mode. We're not whenever we're distressed, we're not bringing our full repertoire of best self solutions and coping mechanisms to the problem. That's we have if we understand that, we should we can that should be the first hug to the self. you know is is appreciating that this is a unique circumstance, and whatever it is I'm feeling and thinking, uh like we often have, see, we construct response mechanisms in those distress states and invest a lot of belief into these response mechanisms or coping mechanisms, and usually they're either self blame or other blame. Either we project the blame at us, and maybe that becomes a depression, or we turn the blame outwards. It's a deflection. Uh, and in neither case is it an entirely healthy coping mechanism. It's a defense mechanism, but it's one born out of limited resources. We're doing the best we can. We're under resourced. We're under threat. We're in a state of contraction. Swami always said that love is expansion and self is contraction. So we should be skeptical of anything that is contraction. We know that that's a kind of, we know that's not the healthy path forward. So we should be maybe even distrustful or skeptical of of our thoughts and self coping mechanisms when we're distressed. I think that's the first thing we can do at the foundational level. We all, the more we understand that, the easier it is for us to deal with our own emotional upsets. Now, what can we do for somebody else? That's that's another question.
That reminds me, I had heard about this, that when someone is upset with you, you don't have to think that I am the cause of somebody being upset with me, because that's usually our default, especially in personal relationship. If someone is upset with me, uh, we become defensive. No, no, I didn't cause. I am not the problem. I didn't do anything, and that
Right,
defense mechanism creates feeds the fire, or
right,
feeds the other person being even more upset, and
right.
and then one feeds the other, and usually becomes argumentative and leads to ugly conversations. And the originally something which could have been simply resolved with that the other person is upset
Yeah,
and I don't take responsibility of me being the cause of that person being upset, but just accept the fact that the other person is upset. And when the other person is upset, I accept the fact that the other person is upset, seeing things just the way they are. And I can provide a loving and a listening ear and be present with that person without reacting. If there is something helpful I can say in that situation, literally, what we're talking is love and hugs, whether
yeah,
figuratively or physically
yeah.
or through words. And as you're
Right.
saying, woe is I, that what do I do to myself, with myself, for myself, when I'm upset, when I am in stress or distress? That instead of rejecting myself, which is a contracting, as you're talking, deficit, which means you're net negative, if
Yeah,
I can come up with thoughts or words or beliefs or doing something which will pull me out of that negative, dark situation. It could be listening to music, going for a walk, spending time with
right.
loved ones or pets, or engaging yourself in a favorite hobby, singing, dancing. Uh, if nothing else, all of us can do deep, relaxing breathing. That happens to have an immediate effect, and no skill is required in deep breathing. Just however we are breathing, just deepen the breath and take a little bit extra time. Slow that respiratory process.
Yeah,
Another point is that we tend to run away from pain, which is our defense mechanism, which is our survival instinct. And we tend to turn towards addictions to avoid pain or painful situation. And the addiction can be not just the opioids and drinking and smoking. Addictions are anything. And nowadays, the most common addiction is just the screens of some sort, a phone or a television or a laptop, but also tea, coffee, sugar, or just some sort of snack food. I just want to point out that habitually turning towards those comfort foods and drinks are not going to help the situation in a long term. I don't
Right.
think there's anything wrong with turning to some sort of an elixir to calm yourself down if it is once in a while. But if it is the only way to calm yourself down, then I think
Right.
we have to find new ways of other options.
Right. I think that's right. There's a difference between short-term remedies for short-term, like in an emergency, restoring oneself to baseline safety, feeling good, restoring oneself like that. If it's a cookie and a glass of milk and a hug and a nap on the floor with a blanket, that's awesome. But obviously, long term, cookies and milk don't solve real underlying problems, and it gets back to that dynamic. Uh, Emergencies are one thing, um, but when we're in a state of we can only we can only entertain creative problem solving when we're in a state of emotional equilibrium, right? Crisis time is never the time to hatch a plan for how you're going to make your life better. It might be the motivation to make a plan, but it's not usually the best time to hatch a plan. Uh, it requires creativity, requires um, emotional well being, and rethinking oneself, redressing things, examining oneself has to be done when we're in a state of well being. Uh, the rest are just coping mechanisms, I suspect. They're not long term solutions. The two kind of foundational principles of mindfulness therapies that are popular in this country today. The two foundational principles of them are present moment awareness, non judgmental acceptance. Those are kind of the two foundational principles of mindfulness therapies: present moment awareness, and two, non judgmental acceptance. That becomes a great place to have a creative brainstorm session about how do we want to be different? How do we want to live? How do we want to feed ourselves, uh, grow ourselves, support ourselves?
So I am upset about a situation. What does present moment awareness mean while I'm being upset?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I think usually when we're upset, let's assume that if we're upset, let's go back to this idea that let's revisit this assumption that there's a contraction going on with us within us. So if we're upset, we can expect that our perspective, the way we're looking at things, it has probably been narrowed. We're maybe only seeing part of the entire horizon. We're not seeing the full picture. And usually, when we're upset, the last thing we can do is see the fault in ourselves. Usually, okay, maybe we can take a different example, but I'm just instantly picturing how something outside of us triggered this event. And now maybe somebody else. I feel this way because somebody else said something or did something. It could be like that. We're usually not inclined to look back at ourselves in a honest way. Usually, see what happens, I think typically is that when we're in a state of emotional distress, the the ego self wants to preserve the self. And so the ego self wants to promote a narrative, a self narrative that is designed to protect and insulate the self. So that usually is some kind of like, usually the blame will never fall back on the self. I'm innocent, I'm a victim, or something like that. One of those kinds of narratives will oftentimes be promoted. And when we're upset, like the ego has a lot of opportunity and power to sell a narrative that we're inclined to believe in because it insulates us and it's like our own self hug. It's a way of protecting and protecting the self, really. That's what those kinds of unhealthy defense mechanisms are usually about, is giving yourself a hug, protecting the self. And that's why when we're upset, we're not usually in a position to have present moment awareness or non-judgmental acceptance. I mean, the first part is would just be present moment awareness. See, like in a traditional, like I am not a therapist and I have never practiced this. I don't have any training or anything in this mindfulness therapy, but the foundations of it come from meditation, which we are familiar with, and that's the connection. I think present. A patient goes to the doctor and says, "I've been troubled with this for months and months, and my life is in distress." When we're coping with ongoing distress, our thinking and feeling is uh, so haywire that even to pay attention to, even to give present moment attention to the problem is so can be so painful that we can't even look at it. And so we turn our attention away. We're not even prepared to concentrate or think about that thing for a minute or 30 minutes. It's so uncomfortable. So we avoid, or so like just to be able to slow oneself down and say, okay, let me spend time with this. Let me spend 60 seconds. Let me spend 30 minutes. Let me spend 60 minutes just being present with it, being willing to be in the same room. That's step one. Now, what's accomplished by that? The second part of the mindfulness is non judgmental acceptance. So, not only do you have to be in the room with that feeling, which may even include acknowledging your own faults. I think present moment awareness is about seeing things as they are.
Well, seeing things as they are opens up another box of Pandora, because when we are triggered, what I find for myself is that being triggered or being triggered to a trauma or being traumatized is no different from I put my hand on a hot plate or a sharp object. Uh, I think the first thing to do is to move yourself or remove yourself away from the cause of trauma. So there is no
Right.
bravery in continuing to
Put your
stress
hand on the
yourself.
stove.
Yeah. And then while my hand is on the flame, then I look for solutions. There's no need for that.
Correct.
And we tend to do that in relationships. We continue to hurt ourselves. And while shouting at the top of our voice, figuratively or literally, the first thing I found is time out, move away from the situation that is causing the stress and calm my temperature down, whether it is physical temperature or it is what is happening in the mind or emotions. And seeing things the way they are is coupled with the present moment awareness, which means what just being in the present, not running our mind crazy about
Yeah.
what could happen, what will happen if this continues go if this situation doesn't stop, this could turn into a really ugly situation. We'll look at the worst case scenario.
Mm.
We'll look at things unfavorable to us.
Right. Right.
And then also we look in the past. We're not being in the present.
Right.
Oh,
Correct.
if this happened, then that must have been the cause. Well, I was not aware. This is a terrible thing. And
I think it's very common that people who are distressed get stuck on, they'll replay over and again events of the
e-
past.
events that have not happened that triggered. So present moment awareness in a situation which is stressful, I think the key is to objectively look at the situation as is, as a snapshot, nothing more, nothing less, detached from all past events. And since no future has taken place, it doesn't exist. And
Yeah.
looking at it, as you were mentioning, in a detached, dispassionate, non judgmental fashion, and neither putting blame on myself or putting blame on someone else. Why was the fire on? Should I have more tolerance for putting my hand on the fire? These are the kind of things we argue, and they are futile. I need to know that this situation is not working for me. I need to find ways. Okay, how do I handle things that are hot? Oh, I can put some gloves on myself. Uh, you know, there are ways to handle difficult situations which doesn't trigger those traumas, and I'm still able to participate in those situations. So I think the key here for me is self-love. If I can loving and kind and accept my current situation without judging it, and as you're saying, what if that person is me? That is true. Woe is I. When I have found a way to deal with the situation with myself, then and only then can I be compassionate with others who are behaving erratically because they are triggered, who are upset because they are upset. And they're allowed to be upset because I am not in that situation. I don't know how hot that hot plate is, or how sharp is that object.
Right. Their suffering is theirs to have, subjective and unique to them.
And we don't know what is underneath those clothes. Are there old wounds that are being touched and they feel extremely painful to that person? I have no idea.
That's right.
So, giving a listening
Definitely.
ear to myself, giving a listening ear to the other person without even a need to respond sometimes, just sitting with myself, sitting with that person, whether you want to conclude it with I love you or I love me, that in one shape or form, whether it's verbal or non-verbal. At a later point, Jeremy, I think we need to take on this topic and explore it even further. One is the present moment awareness, and other is loving acceptance or non-judgmental
Hmm.
acceptance.
Yeah, and I think another subject in there is like the discrimination of our the voice of self. Because I don't, for example, when we're in emotional distress, oftentimes the voice of self is broadcasting from a distressed channel, and the and and often is broadcasting unreliable advice. And it's hard, I think, for us to discriminate between that voice, the the voice that's maybe giving, that's broadcasting from a state of fear, versus the voice of reason and wisdom. Which is the true voice? How can I tell the difference? They both sound the same in my head. They both sound real. I think that's another important subject when we go into present moment awareness and non judgmental acceptance. There's a refocusing that I think happens in our perspective. Meditation is has a lot to do, in my opinion, has a lot to do with separating yourself from yourself to be an observer of yourself. It allows for a kind of objective clarity. You know what I mean? Maybe truth is subjective, but there's an objectivity that I think we get if we can separate ourselves from ourselves to observe ourselves.
I think
That's
it's
really
not.
different from being like, I am the subject of this crisis, and I feel under threat, and I'm in the center of it all. Those are two different points of view entirely. What were you going to say? I'm sorry.
The arguments ensue because we all see things from our own perspective. Truth, as you're saying, is in some way relative. Our
Yeah.
so It's not as much about the factual information. You said this, I said that. No, no, I didn't mean it. You didn't understand that correctly. But you are the one who started it. No, you started it. It is not about,
Right. Those facts never get
but I think
resolved.
the truth is, the truth of the matter is how I felt in that situation, how the other person felt in that situation, because that's the experience. One person jumps in the water and having a refreshing swim, and another person jumps in the water and is gasping for breath. What's the
Right.
fault with the water? Or what's the fault
Right.
with me?
Right.
So we tend to find faults in either the situation or ourselves, or who pushed me in the water, or why did you even bring me here? So I think, as you're saying, instead of being the persona, the personality that it is happening to me, I have to remove myself from the situation by being an observer, by looking at the sequence of events as if I'm watching a movie. And then if the blame game starts to happen, which is very mental
Natural.
activity, perhaps the question would be, is there something I need to learn from the situation? Could I do something differently? How can I avoid this situation the next time? What can I do to protect myself?
Right. Well, I think with that kind of like self observation, we can start to, over time, discriminate between our impulses or our actions or our words that are motivated by a defense mechanism or a coping mechanism versus actions and words that are motivated by something healthier, something more intentional. Like, this is really how I feel. This is what I would like to say. This is what I would like to do, and feel proud of that, rather than, like, so often we do things we realize in hindsight, oh, like, that was a mistake. I wasn't bringing my best self with those words or those actions. And it begins by observing the thoughts, you know? And if we can start to even go beneath the thoughts and say, where do those thoughts come from? They're broadcasting from who? What point of view is broadcasting this thought pattern? Oh, Sunil's the problem. He's so selfish. Maybe I'm broadcasting from, maybe that is a defense mechanism. Maybe the motivation of that voice is really something that's covering up my own hurt. Maybe I'm not looking at something in me. That In that way, I think the kind of stepping outside of yourself to observe yourself is very helpful. If it allows us to start to discriminate between the different voices and the motivations of those voices, where are those things coming from? We can inquire.
I'm going to repeat this, something that I am I'm practicing or learning, that instead of fault finding, which means, and that doesn't make my ego feel good. Who wants to admit their fault?
Right?
Uh, Nobody wants to be wronged, let alone accepting your own faults. But the alternative way to look at it is, what is it? How can I improve? What is it that I'm supposed to learn from the situation? Then it becomes an improvement, that wherever I am going at a higher ground from this point. Whereas fault finding tends to make people dig downward. At least that's
Yeah,
what you think.
that's no, that's a good observation. But I think it's also explainable by like natural. laws of economy. You know what I mean? In a sense that, like, which one takes more energy? Does it take more energy for me to evaluate myself and improve and change myself? Or is it take less energy for me to just say, I'm fine. The problem is outside of me and deflect the blame outside. In some ways, it's so much more efficient to just quickly assign blame to something outside of you and thereby tell yourself no need for me to change. I can stay in homeostasis. I can be in a state of equilibrium. No reason for me to go outside of my comfort zone, right? That's economy. I think that is an important. I think that explains part of the coping mechanism biology that we have of, like, avoiding avoidance, deflection, blame, avoidance. Uh, you know, I think it's just. I think it's about economy. Honestly, it spares us the trouble of going outside of homeostasis, equilibrium, safety.
I think, in a nutshell, it boils down to loving thoughts, loving words, loving actions, whether it is towards me or somebody else, probably can be a guiding principle. Hi, Jeremy. Let's continue the rest of the topic another time.
Okay,
Love
good
you.
to talk to you. Love
Sairam.
you too. Sayonara.